Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments on my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Tariq and Hazel videos. Celebrity on YouTube says, it's a bummer that Tariq is so dishonest because it paints poly people in a bad light. Yes, agreed. Lucy says, it's honestly embarrassing how everyone on the show was making faces, shaking their heads in disapproval at Tariq and Hazel's polyamory. They're being extremely judgmental. Glad they explained and stood their ground for their own truth. Agreed. It was a bit surprising. It's interesting because as you watch the show, you watch Julia or Yulia, and you think, oh, she seems like she's a great person, and then you see her reacting to the people on the show, and you're like, oh, you're judgy. Bao says, polyamory isn't for me either, but that doesn't make it wrong. If people are consenting adults and not hurting anyone, it's none of anyone else's business. Agreed. Sorry says, I have never been in a polyamory relationship, and it's not for me, but I don't understand why it's so difficult for some people to understand it. Well, the reason is because it's massively cultural. I don't know of any culture in the world that, well, let's just put it this way. A lot of cultures in the world have a problem with the premises involved in polyamory. We have a heuristic, that is, if you're in a relationship and one person is having sex with another person, then it is a dishonest deception. It's, problematic. It's destructive, because it often is. Because often what's happening is the person is cheating. But they just reduce it down to if two people are in a relationship and you have sex with someone else, it's automatically wrong. A similar thing, as you'll hear me rant about, is age differences. We know through research and a lot of anecdote that if a 25-year-old is dating a 13-year-old, it is almost always a problem. Let's just say it's always a problem. 99.9% of the time it's going to be a problem. And thus, we don't have to investigate it. If a 25-year-old is dating a 13-year-old, we don't need to know anything more. That's all we need to know is that age difference, and we say, no, that 13-year-old is being harmed somehow. But then we take that heuristic and we say any age difference in a relationship is a problem. So you have a 50-year-old with a 25-year-old, automatically a problem to people. And that is just not the case. Research doesn't show that. Anecdote doesn't show that. Can it be a problem? Yes. Can a 50-year-old exploit a 50-year-old? Yes. Can a 25-year-old abuse a 50-year-old? Yes. But when we talk about age difference of 25 to 13, we don't need to hear anything more. So we do the same thing with polyamory. When you have a relationship, when you hear about an extramarital relationship, it is this heuristic of it's always wrong. But it's not always wrong, clearly. But so that's why people do it. I understand it, but it is upsetting to watch that judgment happening before our eyes for Tariq and Hazel, and they did stick to their guns, which is good. Patricia on YouTube says, as a polyamorous person, it really hurts seeing them shake their heads like everything Tariq is saying is wrong. I don't think people would be so judgmental. I didn't think people would be so judgmental of polyamory. Yeah, I think it's easy in my world to, and maybe for you, Patricia, maybe for you, sorry, and others, that you might live in a bubble of acceptance of various different things. And then you watch a TV show like this and you see people reacting and we're reminded, oh yeah, that's right. 99.9% of the planet is not on board with this point of view, or at least a lot of people aren't. And the people in my circle, maybe physically that I am interacting with and or people that I follow on Twitter are totally fine with this, but a lot of people aren't. The majority of people aren't, in my anecdotal opinion. So this next comment is actually an email that was sent in, and it was from someone who comments below, and they say, oh my gosh, double fangirl moment. Not only did you, meaning me, read my comment in your most recent comment reaction video, but Sean from 90 Day Fiancé actually replied to my comment. I lost my mind as much as I am embarrassed. I should have used present. So essentially what the commenter had said was telling me, Kirk, well, so let's go back to the beginning. So I was talking, and I often do, about how great Sean is at asking questions. And as I'm thinking of a question, like I hope someone asks this question, Sean often will ask that question. And the commenter said something along the lines of, well, actually, Sean is a a longstanding or was a longstanding journalist and had won awards and this kind of thing. And then Sean replied, and I looked at the reply, and it said something along the lines of, I still am a journalist, because the commenter was saying, in the past, Sean, anyway, so the listener says, I should have used present tense instead of past. She corrected me. I apologized. I hope she doesn't hate me. Frowny face. Yeah, I'm sure she doesn't hate you. The way it looked to me, the comment, was she was just being playful. But the other thing here is that Sean watches my reaction videos. Like, what is happening? And then I thought, well, if I was Sean, I'd want to know too. I would want to know, you know, I wonder what a therapist thinks of the kind of questions I ask, you know, and I'm often complimentary, so maybe that helps her to feel a little bit better about what she was doing. I imagine that for Sean, it is a multifaceted experience to do these things. There's so much chaos that's happening. She has to create conversation. She has to ask the questions that we're all wanting to ask. She has to manage conflict. She's listening to producers in her ears. There's cameras, there's lights, there's, you know, it is a very, very hard job, I'm imagining. And to keep your head straight in that scenario, I think would be hard. And so, I don't know, I think I'd be interested in what others had to say about it. So apparently I don't know, does she watch all the reaction videos? Maybe she's a fan of the show. I don't know. It's interesting to think. And by the way, I'm actually getting some direct messages from a number of cast members, and it's been interesting to communicate with them directly. I care about all of them, even the ones that a lot of people hate, and usually the communication doesn't go much beyond like, hey, thank you, or hey, you're welcome, that kind of stuff. It doesn't usually go much beyond that. Anyway, Andrew and Amira videos from last week. Yo-Yo-Yo, good old Yo-Yo-Yo, says, as someone who experienced domestic violence, I totally understand Amira wanting to be interviewed separately. You're literally scared of that person. Agreed, yo. All That She Is says, the fact that people couldn't respect Amira and her experience was angering to me. Agreed. Lindsay says, I research how sexual abuse is portrayed in the media. I want to save this clip and play it each time I hear someone ask, why didn't the survivor come forward sooner? The data shows most victims never report, and we can see why by this video. She not only has to deal with the trauma of the abuse from Andrew, she is immediately doubted and ganged up on by the cast. Meanwhile, the same group of people are happy to defend Andrew when he just displayed coercive behavior. Absolutely, Lindsay. Well said. And after watching that, I don't know if I got all my points out that I wanted to. And so that was one of the points I think that I didn't really get to. You know, I'm thinking off the top of my head, and sometimes after I'm done, I'm like, wait, I probably should have mentioned, that was on my brain, but I didn't mention it. And that was one of them, was that we can see in this video exactly why. And Lindsay, yeah, just use this as because, you know, we can agree that Yulia and the others are average people, probably, and women, included, were telling Amira, I don't understand why you're not letting him in the room. Now, you could make the excuse for them that they didn't know what Andrew had said to them. But the sheer fact that Amira is saying, I'm terrified. I'm not saying I don't want to talk to him as a preference. I'm just saying I don't want to talk to him because I'm terrified anyway. I'm having a fear reaction. And the fact that everyone just piled on and just said, like, I don't understand what's going on here. Like, we want to hear from... And they had already seen the way Andrew had behaved. So they had that data point to go off of, that Andrew was just like, wait, I'm going home. If you're not going to, that behavior should at least be a red flag for something weird is going on here. Why is this guy so rigid about that? Just step out of the goddamn room, you a-hole. You'll get your turn. Did you not learn how to take turns in kindergarten? This is not your turn. She wants to talk by herself, then you can, just relax. Just go in the other room. It's not a big deal. Why is that so hard to imagine? Well, we have a number of different premises in our culture and a lot of cultures around the world that are working against victims coming forward. This notion of like, get over it. Stop complaining. Emotions are for the weak. People should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstrap. Face your fears. Stand up. Sometimes those ideas are helpful. Say a kid is at the playground and they're a little tentative. They want to play in the playground, but they're also kind of scared of the other kids. And they're going back and forth. And as a parent, you might say, like, you can do it, you can. And the kid goes, I don't know if I would. And you kind of know that the kid wants a little bit of a pep talk, and you're like, you can do it. I know you can do it. Be brave. You can get out there. And then the kid goes, plays in the playground, and everything works out. So sometimes this premise works out, but to use it all the time is, of course, ridiculous. And yes, this is why normal, seemingly good people, even women, hearing Amira say, I am terrified, and for them to just let that go past them and say, I don't understand. Why don't you let him in the room? What's wrong with you? And now the internet is piling on her as well. And it's upsetting. And we just have so long to go. Me Too happens, and we get a little bit of growth, a little bit of opening up of the door, but clearly we still have a massive problem, especially when you consider the entire planet. It's just, it's upsetting. Gapier says, yeah, there was a lot of victim blaming. Agreed. Carolyn said, agree with Dr. H. Andrew wants to build consensus through bullying and manipulation. He wants one narrative of the story to prevail, his own. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the motivation was for Andrew to stay in the room, but the method in which he did it, I thought, was indicative of something going wrong in his personality. Again, why wouldn't you just go in the other room? You could protest. You'd be like, well, I just want to publicly protest. I don't like this, but fine, I'll go in the other room. And you go in the other room. Amira says her piece, you come on and you defend yourself. Fine, that's expected. But you're going to pout and go home and refuse to even participate in it. Now he's, it's in his right to do so, but presumably you went there to speak your mind, and now you're just going to go, pout and go home. But then when he talked about why he wanted to stay, it was because, how am I supposed to build consensus? How am I supposed to find a consensus? Again, when I saw that clip, I thought, that is a ridiculous build consensus. How in the world are you supposed to build consensus? The only way you could build consensus is if you admit that you were coercive and controlling and hurtful to her in a completely unfair way, and pressuring to her in a completely unfair way. Is Amira exaggerating a little bit? Maybe. But we have enough data based on the show, the text exchange, these kinds of things, to know that there was something going on there that we could look at. And yeah, but I even hesitate to say that because the show is heavily edited. Who knows? Anyway. By the way, new merch, Don't Be a Jerk Face shirt that my wife designed, and it is now available. You should be able to click below. You don't have to get this color. Some people are like, yellow, that's pretty obnoxious. I actually like it on yellow. I think it to be the perfect color. As an Asian person, I'm supposed to not wear yellow because it makes my skin look funny, but I never really understand what people are saying when they say that. I just don't see that with my eyes. But anyway, Don't Be a Jerk Face. You can get it on a mug. You can get various different colored shirts. You can get a pillow. People asked for it, and the wife provided it. Mike and Natalie video. The Beast on YouTube says, the notion that men and women can't be friends is not only ridiculous, it is also so heteronormative and allonormative. They act like every woman is into men and vice versa, and that everyone wants to have sex. WTF, agreed the Beast. Yulia says, in Russia, we have a saying, there is no such thing as a friendship between a man and a woman. One or the other always wants more. Interesting saying. It very much is cultural, yeah. And thank you for letting me know about that, Yulia. That would explain why people from that region, even maybe Ukraine, also have those points of view. Anyway, Catherine says, as a female with a number of close male friends, I find the notion that men and women can't be friends to be ridiculous. Agreed, Catherine. M says, good old M, MRE. I don't know how to say your name, M. It's just a bunch of letters. Since you know the cast members so well, I am among those who say please watch and react to Happily Ever After. Well, M, your wish is my command. I will be watching Happily Ever After as soon as it starts, which is tomorrow. Angela and Michael video. Bears with Glasses says, I suspect Angela didn't have very much support growing up and may have felt like she constantly needed to fight for a place and for survival. Agreed, Bears with Glasses. Daisy says, I wonder if Dr. Honda would react this way if the roles were inverted regarding gender. Michael is clearly afraid of Angela's reactions. This has a lot to do with how Angela reacts, both being physically and emotionally abusing to Michael. I think this should be acknowledged. Agreed, Daisy. I mean, I hope that I am being fair regardless of gender in the dynamic between Angela and Michael. I'm biased. I have my own point of view, and it'll show as I talk about things. Everyone has a bias. Everyone has a place that they're coming from. But I do want to state for the record that regardless of gender, that you have one individual who is being abusive verbally and sometimes physically. It's a memeable moment when she smashes the cake in his face, but that is not okay. I know people that, it's just a cake. Imagine if your spouse did that in anger. Imagine if anyone did that in anger. That would ruin a relationship, I'm here to tell you. That is a massive physical violation. And why would you do that? What would be the purpose? If you want to state that you're hurt, if you want to state that you're afraid, fine. If you want to state you're angry, that's fine. But to put hands on, to try to humiliate another person is not okay. And a lot of Angela's behavior is not okay. And I think it gets kind of normalized, or we get numb to it on a certain level. I think Angela comes across as both vulnerable and abusive. So I think sometimes we can relate to her in a certain way and we're like, well, sometimes she loses her temper. That does not make it okay at all, regardless of gender, for sure. Demi Lovato video from last week. Sweetie Darlin', good old Sweetie Darlin', says, I wish me and my family had known about Al-Anon meetings in the past. We were told by a rehab therapist that we should protect ourselves first and foremost, but we got no further guidance on how to actually do that while still supporting the addicted family member. Yeah. Al-Anon is a good resource, but also just a therapist that specializes in that sort of thing can also be a good resource. Good old Russell in Purple says, very interesting point about people in recovery jumping into relationships. I wonder if it commonly happens in recovery from any other mental health problem, like eating disorders or OCD, or is it just addiction? Well, Russell, it can be, but it's very common in addiction when we are recovering from a substance abuse problem to fall into a relationship too quickly and it interfering with our recovery, and or early recovery kind of messing with our heads a little bit to make us believe we're in love with someone when we just like to date them. It can sort of exaggerate that feeling that you have in the beginning of a relationship and make us commit to things that we regret later. So a lot of people in recovery, substance abuse recovery, will talk about you might fall in love, and just be careful because that's very common. And one, it can be a distortion of your brain in early abstinence and early sobriety. It can also be a way of avoiding your recovery as well. Anyway, but with eating disorders, OCD, other kinds of recovery processes, can one have a similar thing? Sure, but it's a little different, and I think it's not as common. But can it happen? Yeah, absolutely. Could you be recovering from OCD and have a lot of space to finally be able to date, and then you meet someone and you think, oh my God, I'm experiencing love without the obsessions, without the compulsions, without the anxiety. This feels so good. Let's get married. And then a year later, you're like, we were not a good match. We could see how that could happen. Because similar to addiction, if you're suffering from OCD from the age of 13 until you're 35, you don't really know what it's like to live without OCD. And then you start to be low symptoms or no symptoms, and suddenly you're free to be yourself for the very first time. And as you start to date, you are essentially operating from that of a 13-year-old, which is someone to fall deeply in love and to be completely distorted in your brain. Not that older people are incapable of that, but we're particularly capable of that when we're young. Catherine says, thanks for speaking so candidly about your concerns in this video with Demi Lovato. The overarching takeaway I had from the documentary was that this woman is still in trouble and surrounded by enablers. The fact that her team thought this could be framed as a triumphant recovery story just belies how ill-equipped they are to support her. I'm scared for her too. Right. So this brings up something that I debated and I didn't really talk about much. Is she surrounded by enablers? I don't know if we know that. We saw comments that are definitely in the direction of enabling, but it's hard to say, because if you're a friend of hers and she has, say that you believe abstinence is the only way, and this goes for not just Demi Lovato, but anyone. If we have someone in our life who is struggling with substance abuse, and maybe even we're an expert, maybe we've been through recovery ourselves, maybe we're a professional in that. And well, I'll just tell you for myself, I know people who are in recovery right now, and some of them are in that phase that Demi Lovato seems to be in, which is to be kind of playing around with it a little bit. They're very much dedicated to recovery, and they're doing a lot of the right things, but they're also doing something like what Demi is doing, just like, well, a little bit of alcohol, a lot of weed actually takes the edge off, and it really helps me out. And even though I'm pretty sure as a friend, as a family member, that is destructive and might even lead to them dying, what am I supposed to do about it? Do I completely reject that person and constantly hound that person and say, like, you're wrong, you'll see, even though I don't really know that, but I'm pretty sure? What do I do? Well, one of the other options, you could do that, I suppose, but I don't know how helpful that would be. Or do you stay in contact and worry and maybe subtly influence a little bit and be there for them when they do start to discover that they are relapsing ultimately, and have a relationship with them and not take on the responsibility myself, because it's not my recovery, it's their recovery. And I don't think they're making the right moves, but that's not my job to decide. So is that enabling, or is that being a good friend with someone who is exploring sobriety? I don't know. I don't know what Demi's friends were. Were they enabling, or we'd have to investigate more. It certainly seemed like enabling. The other point that you bring up, Catherine, is that the fact that her team thought this could be framed as a triumphant recovery story just shows how ill-equipped they were. So that's another question mark that I had. Because as I was watching it, I thought the same thing. I thought, wait, they're not going to frame this as a win for her, are they? But there were moments where they actually focused on, the producers would ask the question and then they would include it in the documentary, of them saying, so a few years ago you said the exact same thing, that you struck a balance with alcohol and weed and you weren't going to use hard drugs, and then you had that massive use of heroin and fentanyl, and you almost died and you have brain damage. So what's different this time as opposed to last time? They asked her that question. I can't remember her answer to it. I'm sure it wasn't very, very strong, very convincing of an answer. But they chose to, and then they even flashed back to that scene and re-showed us that clip. So what is the intent of the documentary? Is it are they trying to say that she triumphed, or are they trying to show us the reality? I think it's the latter. I think that they actually, on one hand, it is kind of a triumph that she survived and she's back on the recording train, and she's transformed and she's changed. But is she still in it? Are we going down a really scary road? I think the documentary pretty well portrayed that ambivalence that is in the air. Maybe she will be fine. It's possible. It's not likely, given the way that she talks, and especially the main kicker for me, because I'm always looking for clues, right? The main kicker for me, so we have the idea that she is She says that she's recovered, but she's still using marijuana primarily and alcohol sometimes. We've also heard her talk about how alcohol leads to her using other substances in the past. And that is true. When you drink, your brain just doesn't work quite right, even on 1 or 2 drinks, by the way. But so we have that major data point. But the other big piece of it that really scares me is that she is not in drug and alcohol treatment. She's not going to meetings. If she were going to meetings, if she had drug and alcohol treatment that she was going to every other day, then I would say, well, at least she is on the path, at least some influence, or at least they're checking in, or at least she's learning and really applying it to her life. The way the treatment looked to me was that she had virtually no treatment or very little treatment, and then she had that massive overdose and nearly died and has brain damage from it. And then afterward, from that point forward, it looks to me like she just has that case manager, and I don't know what that even means. And she has an individual therapist, which seems like the therapist is mainly a supportive person. There's just no way to know. It sounded to me like the therapy was mainly a place of listening and humanistic validation, that kind of thing, which is a wonderful thing, and she needs that for sure. But she also needs a massive amount of trauma recovery mentally, and going to listening supportive therapy will not provide that. Now, she might be going through trauma recovery with her therapist. I don't know. It doesn't sound like it by the way she was talking. The other, because she would have said something along those lines, who knows? The other thing that we're not seeing is any kind of drug and alcohol treatment protocol at all. None. We're not hearing anything. She goes into the hospital, nearly dies. She's in the hospital for a long time. And from that point forward, we don't hear about a single NA meeting or a single AA meeting or a single drug and alcohol treatment assessment or we don't hear about anything along those lines. Oh, and we also heard that she went to a trauma intensive, which you heard me comment on that whole thing, that who knows if that was a good idea, but the way she framed it was she had like a week-long trauma intensive thing, which is probably extremely irresponsible to do. And then she came home and used because it was overwhelming. Because of course it was, because that's what trauma recovery involves, meaning that you have to constantly monitor that to make sure that people don't overload on their trauma narrative and exposure. And when you're doing it right, when you're doing trauma recovery right, there's a little bit of distress, but not so much distress. And there's aftercare and a lot of discussion about how to regulate your emotions in a healthy way in between. Anyway, so when you add up all that, this seeming lack of treatment, and then the fact that she's balancing with drugs to balance her drug addiction, then it doesn't look like a good picture. Now, might she have a massive, a huge blowout relapse, or will she slowly realize? It's just hard to know. Will she die? I think that's a definite possibility. I mean, we all understand that people die from drug overdose, particularly the drugs that she uses, and the temptation with Demi and other people like her is when you talk to her and when she's being interviewed, you get the impression like she definitely doesn't want to use hard drugs again, that she learned her lesson. It feels that way, right? It feels like, okay, well, certainly by now she doesn't want to use those things, right? Certainly by now she's not going to, if push comes to shove, she'll just drink a lot, or she'll just smoke a lot of weed, or maybe a little cocaine or something, but she's not going to go back there. That is a tempting belief, but it is not true. I have worked with people, particularly people addicted to opiates, where 99.99999% of them is for sure not wanting to use that substance, but that little bit, the door is a little bit ajar. Their lifestyle isn't shored up well enough. They don't have enough support. They don't have that daily meeting and that daily sponsor, meaning, when you go to AA, you get a sponsor that you can talk to. You still have that friend that might have access to the dealer. If there's a little bit of the doors ajar, then it only takes one moment. It only takes literally like 30 seconds of weakness, or 30 seconds of intent, 30 seconds of like, screw it, for boom, you've got it, boom, you're shooting it, you're sniffing, whatever. And then you could die. And that happens a lot. And it happens a lot to people who are in the entertainment industry because there's so much pressure and so much self-esteem issues and so much travel and so much sleep deprivation and so much negativity from people who hate you. And, it's just a lot of pressure. And, we see this all the time. Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, the countless other musicians and artists. And should we be worried? Yes. Barbara says, as a fan of Demi Lovato, I am very scared. Yes, Barbara, so am I. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.